Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Salinas, and I'm the program manager of the Brentwood Arts Center. I thank you and welcome you to our virtual auditorium for BAC's Conversations on Art series with our host, Meg Linton, and guest artist, Catherine Fairbanks. Our executive director, Amy Gantman, regrets that she can't be here today, but joins me in welcoming you. Brentwood Arts Center's success is due to our incredible and generous board of directors, leadership council, donors, staff, faculty, and students who support the BAC through thick and thin. And I want to thank our anonymous donor who has made the Conversations on Art series possible for the next 12 months. We can only do all that we do because of our generous donors who believe everyone should have access to the arts and education. We'd like to be sure to mention that the new BAC campus in Santa Monica, located at 1625 Olympic Boulevard, is open and fall classes have begun. The campus is in close proximity to 18th Street, Crossroads School, and a metro stop is nearby. We are excited to offer in-person classes once again, so your contributions and enrollments in our courses are more important than ever. Our host, Meg Linton, and BAC Executive Director Amy Gantman met at Otis College of Art and Design while Meg was the Director of Exhibitions for the Ben Maltz Gallery and Amy was the Dean of Continuing Education. The divisions collaborated on many public programs, and we are thrilled to bring Meg's love and respect for artists to the BAC. Meg has been visiting artist studios for over 20 years in her various roles as Director and Curator of Contemporary Art Spaces in Southern California. Currently, Meg is lead producer on a documentary film about feminist performance art in Los Angeles in the 1970s and 1980s called Acting Like Women, directed by Sherry Galkey. She is working on an exhibition about the artist Keith Julius Puccinelli that opens September 24 at UC Santa Barbara, writing a novel, and of course, coming with Catherine Fairbanks for the BAC this afternoon. Welcome, Meg.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's always a pleasure to be here and to be with all of our audience members and with our artists. And I want to thank the BAC, our anonymous donor, and everyone working behind the scenes to make this program possible. Can you believe we're already 3 weeks into September and the pumpkin spice product season is here? Fall is happening, and I hope you're all signing up for the wonderful BAC course offerings and at their in-person classes at their fabulous new space, and also their continuing really wonderful programming online. Mm-hmm. Welcome to our 21st Conversation on Art and our virtual studio visit with Catherine Fairbanks. Before I introduce our guest, I have the usual housekeeping. We're recording today's program, and we ask that you please mute your microphones and turn off your video. It helps with the streaming. During the conversation, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat, and I will either work them into the discussion or save them for the end and make sure that they all get answered. In the chat box, you'll also see that I've put some additional information about our guest for you to peruse on your own. There's also instructions on how to save the chat so you can refer to it later. Catherine Fairbanks and I met about 10 years ago when I was working on the Freeway Studies exhibitions at Otis College of Art and Design, and I just happened to rent a small little studio near hers. I'll never forget our first conversation because she's the only artist who spoke so openly and authentically about empathy and how it can be taught and expressed through the visual arts and visual art. Besides making memorable work out of unusual materials like spent airbags from car wrecks, she's the only ICU nurse I know who I've met outside of an emergency situation. Her work life informs her artistic life and vice versa in the most caring of ways, and with both practices, she makes meaning for herself and others. Catherine uses discarded or humble materials to make her physical objects. She works with her medical community at times, coerces dancers to collaborate with her, and explores mythology, literature, and scientific texts. I want to read a short quote from an interview Catherine gave a couple years ago before we start our conversation. And here she says, "One thing I learned when I met another nurse artist in graduate school is that art often responds poetically when it's up against something real like liver failure or HIV. And that is okay. That is actually the crucial function of art, to not do the same thing as nursing, which looks for the quickest resolution. Catherine takes her time in conceptualizing and making her work. It is a long game balanced against the immediacy of her nursing practice. And we're really thrilled she's here today to talk with us and tell us about her work. So Kathy, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Meg. I feel very lucky, very honored that you invited me to this program that you've done. I'm the 21st person. That's just awesome.
Yeah. So we're very excited and we're very happy it's going to be continuing into next year as well. So,
great. Congratulations. Yeah. That's a tribute to you guys for sure.
Thank you. So we wanted to start today's program with this, which is something that's on your wall in your studio.
Yeah, I sometimes use my studio wall like a drawing book or like a kind of journal, where I'm listening to talks on podcasts and artist talks and philosophy lectures and things like that. Sometimes when I'm working, actually quite a bit when I'm working, and was listening to one about Wittgenstein and learned that he was a really active nurse in I think in World War I, and chose for years to do this kind of not fighting, not being a kind of soldier himself, but working with the wounded and doing a lot of really gritty work. And I was excited and really moved by that. And it just stays up in my studio as a kind of reminder of maybe it's a kind of reminder of like what service can look like, and also the ways that people have these kind of periods in their lives where they do different kinds of work, and whether they're philosophers and artists or in any role, they can kind of move into that space. And that nursing in particular is a it comes from this ancient lineage that's like, it's some kind of Western medicine, but it's also a kind of like medicine. It comes from medicine men, it comes from witchery, it comes from just the studying of parenting, motherhood. There's so many things that come together to become this thing that we call a nurse right now. Mm-hmm. And that we call a nurse in terms of like contemporary medicine and Western medicine. And I imagine what he was practicing looked very different than what I practiced, but also—
Can we back up just for a second and just say this is a quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein, and it says Wittgenstein was a nurse. Someone was saying they couldn't read it very clearly, but he also became he was a nurse in World War II, but to his experience, it became a very prominent philosopher. And so I think the work I'm most familiar with is uncertainty, but anyways, so it's really nice what you're saying. He had this really practical, visceral, empirical experience before he kind of moved to the life of the mind and language.
I think he actually he was starting to work the way that you say it, and on his like philosophical work, on starting to already kind of live in his mind, and then realize that this kind of service work was needed. It was like a necessary component, as it was like this. He was watching his culture participate in this thing that he felt like he was unable to turn away from. And right. I think that's how I understood it. And then he did return, obviously, to his life's work to do this other philosophical work. But that was always really fascinating to me, that he had this sense of something that he couldn't really turn away from, and what that must have looked like, what his own practice potentially looked like as a nurse, and what all kind of nursing looks like even within a war, and then coming back into a space of being an intellectual and doing the other work that he did later. That was just a really fascinating thing for me to learn.
Yeah, it seems like a good parallel.
Yeah.
And then this is something else that's very important to you that's on your wall.
Yeah, this is something that's been on my wall in my studio for many years now. And I do think about empathy as this I'm glad that we talked about it a decade ago. I think about it as this kind of maybe misunderstood and kind of maybe magical category of a kind of love that happens where people kind of have love of strangers and have a desire to do a kind of like service work and kind of understand the kind of difference that strangers exist within. And so I think, you know, I can remember maybe 14 years ago learning about Edith Stein, who was a phenomenologist in the 1920s. She was one of Edmund Husserl's students, and she wrote a PhD called On the Problem of Empathy. And it talks about this kind of infinite difference between two people. And the more that I, you know, read her work and reread that thesis and, you know, spent time thinking about my bedside, my clinical time. I've always worked in an acute care hospital. I was able to think about how you know, think about her ideas, this idea of infinite difference. I think the contemporary idea of empathy as being about similarity is probably kind of an approximation. It's maybe a more comfortable approximation, but maybe isn't really the maybe most interesting or pertinent, like kind of way to conceive of that kind of love. And I wanted to work. I could feel that was kind of happening all around me. I'm watching it with the other nurses that I work with, and I realized that was something that was kind of present in my work. It was present in my mind, and so it was going to be present in my work. And I needed to kind of deal with that in a really verbal way. I could already feel that it was present in my work, and so I thought this language needs to be around me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here's another view of my studio, a recent painting in my studio, and you can see my studio is pretty grungy. So Meg, that's where your studio was.
Yeah.
In the same building. I've been there for about 13 years. And these are a couple of chimney sculptures that I was working on at that time, kind of wheeling them into my studio and building them and then wheeling them back out.
Yeah.
A dancer on my studio rooftop, a dancer, Dylan Crossman, who's a really extraordinary dancer for Merce Cunningham's company. And after the Cunningham company sunsetted after Merce's death, I knew some of the dancers from the company and I got to collaborate with them. And Dylan Crossman and I did a collaborative dance. We choreographed a collaborative dance like for about 7 years, and we finally got to premiere right February 2020, right before the pandemic had caused all the shutdowns. But it was really a kind of utterly romantic experience to make a dance with someone who can do basically anything that he wants to with his body in dance. And it was beautiful. Extraordinary.
And this, we were hoping to be able to show a video, but we couldn't quite get it to work. So do you want to talk about the next 3 images that we're going to see?
Yeah, so this was a really early piece. I wanted to show those last images so people could see where I work. Since I'm talking from home, I don't have a great internet connection at my studio. It's always kind of blurry sounding. So anyways, I'm home, and Meg wanted to give you images of my studio. This is an image from Skowhegan from 2011. And you're looking here into the sculpture shop, and I kind of at nighttime would turn this into my studio and work with these rocks. This comes from a video called Vignettes of There-ness, the Making of a Rock Snowman. And I use this engine hoist and the chains and this kind of like wooden structure that's on the floor there to hold these rocks together. And I was able to you can parse through the next images, Meg. I was able to just kind of raise and lower and interact with the rocks, eventually getting pretty confident, kind of climbing way up on top of them, raising myself up using the engine hoist and getting up almost into the rafters, and just kind of filming this interactive video and this kind of making of almost kind of making a friend. There was a time in my practice where I was really interested in the snowman and these kind of very, very like mythical kind of figures that become a kind of playmate, or they become this kind of constructed human. And I think also the snowman was exciting to me because they're so still. And I think I spend a lot of time as a nurse, we're scurrying a lot. We're always moving very quickly. And there's always like 20 things to do in at the time of about 4 things. My studio practice can sometimes, in the past, could have been kind of harried in that way also. And I think I dreamed about this space of the snowman and this kind of quiet melting away and this kind of slow sense of a still human. So yeah, just some interaction.
And this is some newer work.
This is actually a decade old too.
Oh, it's a decade old now. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
so this is from 2014.
I read that. Yeah.
I started working with this idea of the chimney. You know, I think when I put together the idea of like this kind of snowman and the snow, and then I come all the way into this chimney, I think for me, they're not that far apart because they had come from this lineage of ceramics. And the lineage of ceramics that I was trained in was a lineage that comes from, you know, people like John Roloff, who's a kind of art dad for me, really. He taught at SFAI for a long time, 35 years, I think, and longer, and taught other schools also. But he was working in a kind of greater field of ceramics. And so for me, I was starting to think about just kind of the way that change itself or transformation gets kind of represented by ceramics. And so I was starting to use like the tile, like, you know, very like Italian kitchen tile. And I was starting to use paper mache, like you see here in these chimneys, to represent ceramics. So anything that was kind of, that could exhibit water loss and shrinkage. So the snow was perfect for that. The paper mache, this kind of found tile, all of this in my mind was a kind of ceramic process where you were watching change happen as you're building, but you're not married to this kiln. I think the sense of being married to the tool was not that interesting to me. I wanted to like get away from the tool. And so being able to work with this material that could show change.
Well, and just the object of the fireplace too, being a form of transformation, because there's those really amazing paintings from the Renaissance where people are jumping into the fire and coming out completely transformed, right?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I do think is that the kiln is this moment where the maker doesn't get to watch what's happening. And then in these other like materials that I was working with, I got to watch the entire process. So there's this moment in your work where as a ceramicist, where you have to kind of lose agency, and just a lot of people love that mysterious part, but
you have to really surrender to the elements.
Yeah, I was really going through a time in my practice where I wanted to watch all the parts happen and all of the phases. And so stepping away from the tool of the kiln itself meant I could just kind of make every part of it be exactly what I kind of wanted it to be, or I could at least touch more of those like parts of its maturation instead of just turning it over to the kiln. Yeah. So these are some drawings that are on the wall in that same show. They're made with taking very thin strips of paper mache and then putting them on this on a like kind of heavy paper, and so that when the paper mache dried on the back side of this work, it would emboss essentially the front side, and made these drawings. These are some drawings of a Picasso sculpture called Sylvette that's on the NYU campus. That's this really strange kind of magical cast concrete sculpture. The original traveled actually, I think, from Spain at some point, maybe 7 years ago, and you could see the original, and the one on the NYU campus is this huge constructed like version of it. It's really wonderful sculpture.
And is it bronze or is it?
No, it's concrete actually. Concrete. It's right in front of like I.M. Pei's brutalist like dorm, graduate dorm, and it's yeah, they just work so well together, the building and that concrete form and all of these kind of tucked in spaces. And here are some works from an exhibition in 2016. These are some horsetail hair weavings that I made in Iceland at a residency. And this was, I shouldn't even go on about it, but the story of making these was, it was a kind of incredible experience being in Iceland. I learned a lot about the kind of economy in Iceland. They have like more horses than people, and they do have a slaughtering practice of the horses and eating the horse meat. And I realized that the tails would be available at the butcher. So I contacted a local butcher and then picked up some frozen tails and thawed them in a river, and then trimmed the hair off and shampooed them a lot of times to, kind of wash the blood off of them. They were quite like gory.
Mm-hmm.
And then was, trained in a little tiny hand weaving, a tabletop loom by someone who was a really wonderful weaver who was there.
Well, and horsehair was used for so many things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So another chimney sculpture. This chimney kind of is appearing. This is at Eve Fowler's Space Artist Curated Projects when it used to be in her home in Hollywood. And so the chimney is kind of changing at this point in my practice. I think this is late 2016. It's kind of like, here's another one. This is from 2017 in Barcelona, and they're kind of getting smaller at times. And this is a cast bronze piece. And
when you say, did it just show in Barcelona, or were you on residency?
No, it didn't. I just was at a residency and made it there. And I have it in my home, actually. It looks like a kid's coin bank. It's really like odd little scale and odd little object. And it's kind of a magical experience I was at a residency there called the Wool Factory. That was a lovely space in a massive airplane hangar. Again, this is the same shape, the shape of the chimney. And I'm kind of formally like interested in these solid forms that have this kind of broken space or this open space or a kind of a way into them, a portal or something. And I think in the earliest chimneys,
breathe almost.
Yeah.
But residencies are important to you. You've done quite a few residencies.
Yeah, I've really liked the experience of being like, somehow the experience of the residency shows you something or puts a kind of barrier into your normal practice. So there's some moment in the residency where you have to change what your plan was. And that's been a really good way to set up like, kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but maybe like a good problem for myself to discover. And sometimes that can be hard for me to build into my own studio practice. And a residency is a good way to not have to try to construct the barrier myself, but just to like deal with it when it arrives, I guess.
So were these more works made on the residency, or?
Actually, all of those blue works were from a show in LA at AB Projects, which has just recently moved to Portland, Oregon. They were these kind of mosaic pieces really that came, I think a lot of different influences. I loved working with the Italian tile back in 2014, and I was really drawn to mortar and the way that mortar worked. It kind of seems ceramic-y, it doesn't have to be put in a kiln. It's just this like it's, you can tint it in all sorts of ways. And I was really loving making tile very flat and dealing with these ash glazes. The ash glazes are really unpredictable. So it's kind of putting together a lot of like ways that things could be predictable and unpredictable all, kind of together. And
does this body of work have a title?
It's called Mosaica. That was the show.
Nice.
maybe it was some kind of early attempts at painting too. I definitely was aware that the glaze was something I kind of enjoyed being able to control to a certain degree, but then sometimes wanted to control it more, and, you know, was thinking about a kind of space for imagery, but the ceramic itself also has such integrity that it kind of pushes back against imagery. So that was, you know, good and exciting for me. But then also at times I realized, oh, I think maybe I'm wanting to paint, but ceramic maybe isn't a great medium to deal with that. But I still continue to try that, and perfect timing. So this is like me making some pots and then trying to kind of paint and collage on them. And that's an image of Simone Forti on the right, and on the left another pot that was a dance pot. So this is kind of a coming together of the dance collaboration that I'm working with Dylan. And
how are you just laying like paper right into the ceramic to get the image, or are you doing
I really just
paper,
that's right, I just paper mache'd images and other paper right onto the fired clay. So they're already fired, and just gluing it right on there and kind of making these scenes, maybe kind of making these like paintings in a round. Some other dancers from the Cunningham Company. That's Rashawn Mitchell and Silas Reiner, who are choreographers and dancers themselves. I knew them from the Cunningham Company, but they've since gone on. I think they're at Headlands right now doing a residency, and they dance.
So when you collaborate with them, are you helping create the choreography, or are you actually performing with them, or is it a combination? Or
the big collaborative piece that I did with Dylan, I didn't dance at all. I made a set of drawings that we looked at together to make a set of movements. And then I had some ceramic pieces in that collaboration also that Dylan would sometimes hold and dance with. With Silas and Rashawn, I've never actually collaborated. I'm just very inspired by them and influenced by their ways of kind of seeing the world and making their own work. Again, these are more works about Silas and Rashawn, and I think the next work is about them also. These are kinds of, oh no, maybe one more past them. Yeah, this is also about Silas and Rashawn.
So would they dance for you and then you would draw them?
I just got to see them dance a lot because they do perform. They performed in LA maybe a year and a half ago at Home LA. I think this piece came out of watching them in that dance that was in Pasadena during the pandemic. And I've seen them, they performed some part of the Black Mountain College like retrospective that Helen Molesworth curated in Boston. Silas performed The Changeling, and he performed it here in LA too when it came to the Hammer. And so I got to see him dance a lot when that show was here. And they're both incredibly wonderful dancers. They just performed in Birds, which was one of Cunningham's dances that was just out, I think in Long Island. It was just performed in Rashawn dance. This is Rashawn, although I don't know if he knows the other end is Silas, but this is Rashawn. This is Dylan, again, dancing our dance. Was just really interested in these movements of the body that I kind of see in their dance, and I remember it from the way that Dylan moved also in our dance. So it was exciting just to put these together, I think, in the slideshow.
And the figure laying down becomes kind of a theme in this next group of paintings and ceramics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, again, like the snowman, I was kind of trying to look for, like, think about, like, what is it about the nurse that kind of doesn't come to rest? It's an interesting question. it's like even when they come to rest, there's some, in my mind, there's some way that the word itself is doing work. And I think the way that the chimney works is like, it appears to be this thing at rest, but it's actually doing all this work. And I think I haven't really entirely understood how to say it, but I feel that this thing is happening with the nurse also. Like the word itself is doing a kind of work in culture. And maybe all words are like that when you get to know them really intimately and you've constructed a really intimate understanding of what that word means. So that might be why I've oftentimes wondered if that's true for all writers. Do writers think the word writer has the same kind of kind of depth or heat that a nurse thinks about the word nurse? So do you think there's a lot of like magic in the space of?
Well, I think what's interesting about this shape too is that it's a restful image, but it's in action, is what you're kind of talking about. It's doing these dual.
Yeah. And that again,
it seems like they're opposing each other. It's being like the figure's able to hold contradiction.
Yeah, and I also think that the way that the chimney represents a kind of like mysterious, like a kind of I think it's a representation of love in a way. I mean, if I really just get simple about it, it has this kind of feeling of being about a kind of love. And I think that just seemed like a clear thing that was already in the body, but maybe it hadn't been like exactly explicit before. And so I think that's why it felt right to me to put it in the body.
Well, and the chimney, I mean, there's so many powerful metaphors around it in terms of being the heart of the home, but it's a conductor of air and heat. So it breathes and moves.
Yeah.
And so to put the chimney is kind of at the center part of the body.
And I also think there's something about the chimney as it like goes in and out of embeddedness within structures and then becomes like solitary again too. Like I oftentimes think about the nurse is really this kind of being that's like embedded in culture, and it's embedded within a big system. Like they don't really do things on their own. I don't believe in these kind of solitary heroes. I think they're doing this work like within a huge group, within a huge structure of like Western medicine. And that's like how they're guided now, but they have this ancient lineage. They do make decisions alone in their practice at times, but the majority of what they're guided by are these structures that are much bigger than them. And I think the way that they're kind of embedded, oftentimes for me, that's a part of like, I don't know, embedding the chimney in the body or something also.
But it's also interesting as a system or a house or a structure decays, the chimney, because it's usually made out of stone, is the last thing standing.
Yeah.
So you've moved from the ceramics to then painting. Is this just on canvas, or is this like?
This is a fresco, actually. This is a one fresco, which I was so lucky to get to go back to Skowhegan in 2021 and be their kind of like COVID consultant on campus, which really just meant I got to like make work for 4 months. And we were so lucky. We did some nasal swabs, but we never had an outbreak. And Sarah Workna, who was just recently the previous director of Skowhegan, brought me back, I think, really to give me a break, because she knew that I had been in the, working in the pandemic ICU, that I was pretty wrecked from it. And so anyways, while I was there, lo and behold, I had another thing happen where I couldn't use the kiln in the amount that I wanted to. And I was at night one evening in my cabin. My husband was like, I think I'm going to go to the fresco talk tomorrow. And I was like, oh yeah, I should do that. I should do that. I tried that a decade ago and it went terribly. That the teacher at that time said I made the second worst fresco he'd ever seen. It was like part of an owl or something. I can't even remember. But anyways, I had a great experience this time in 2021 going into the fresco barn. And I realized how much I'd been wanting to work with something like paint that I could watch happen and be a part of all the process of it. But it was also very wet and very similar to clay, and had a lot of like similar principles to working with ceramic. It was really exciting. So was really, really glad to be reintroduced to it. And then I've been making it in my studio also, more frescoes. This is all from a show that was at AB Projects downtown, Meg, at the Bendix building.
So are these fired?
Yeah, these are fired. This was fired a lot of times. And then on the very outside, I put some like kind of what's called underglaze, like a very thick coating of underglaze over it, and then fired it again. So that's one of the joys of ceramic, is that you can, you know, just kind of dial the kilns down and do new things to it. And then the new layers that you put on that fire lower, they don't interrupt the previous layers underneath that fired higher. I don't know how to explain that exactly, but you have, as long as you're lower firing, you won't ruin your kiln, and you can just kind of continue to like plunge these things into other layers, and it's kind of exciting. They start to look like candy or like M&Ms or something to me, like cracked brownies. Yeah. I mean, I also have to say, looking at these sculptures, when I was making these during the pandemic, I was working in my studio yard, and it was a pretty scary time. I was like going into the med center, and I was pretty scared, and the other nurses that I worked with, we were pretty scared in that first year before the vaccinations, wearing a lot of plastic and, you know, a lot of every bit of PPE that we could wear. But it definitely did, you know, change. Making these small sculptures was a I can't really explain exactly the feeling, but something that I had in my mind when I would have a studio day after a med center day, is I had this desire to make things that were like smaller than I'd ever made before. I had this desire to like deal with very tiny amounts of material, and that had never really happened to me before. I'd always kind of wanted to make really big things, but I was starting to look at really tiny amounts of stuff, and that was an exciting change for me. So
do you think that was just because you were so overwhelmed? It's like you just wanted to focus in and like really control something?
Yeah, I think it was. And I also think that like I was making a lot of these with porcelain, and porcelain is kind of like, it acts like, it's almost like butter. It's like it wants to fall apart like really easily. But when you're dealing with really tiny amounts of it, you have a little bit more control over them. So I think that was maybe something that was also happening, was like dealing with porcelain. But here, obviously I've recovered in this image, and I want to make
bigger.
Yeah, exactly. So this was this spring at Artist Curated Project at Eve Fowler's awesome space, and just a lot of paintings. I've just continued painting since I went back to Skowhegan in 2021. Works on canvas, and then that centerpiece is a very small fresco, and that piece on the right is a very small fresco. And I'm just continuing on in that path of kind of, here we have an image where like the nurse is kind of embedded underneath the landscape. And that's kind of continued. I just start the paintings with these nurses underneath them, and then this other.
And you said this is fresco.
No, this is canvas. The other small works in between are fresco.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was this in this recent show as well?
No, that was in AB projects.
Okay.
Yeah. Although all these works, like, you know, making a show is kind of strange because you pluck these things together that are turning you on in a way, or they're kind of, you know, I don't usually make really thematic shows. I'm showing the things that are kind of most turning my mind on at the moment of an exhibition. And so the last couple of years have largely been these nurse sculptures and then paintings of them, and then oftentimes landscapes or almost abstractions with the nurses underneath. So I am looking at this work from 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago or 3 years ago, and it's still very present. Yeah. I mean, even a decade ago now with the chimney works, I still feel all those big chimney works very active in the space of my mind. If I look back at some work from 15 years ago, it's not active in my mind anymore. So I know that there are these changes and these kind of revolutions that happen, but 10 years ago is still very active in there.
Yeah.
It's a very small fresco. You can kind of see the nurse underneath that lake on that last fresco, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Close up of a nurse sculpture brings back kind of a lot. That's a self-portrait. I didn't make very many self-portraits, but that's a self-portrait of me with my cat. And I think, you know,
And
I
this
did
is
a
the
lot of
porcelain, right?
pet therapy.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I know, as we're kind of heading out of it, but yet numbers are increasing again, and
Yeah.
but it's amazing how you talking about the fear of going first in, and it was like, yeah, there was so much fear.
A lot of fear.
A lot of people are just pushing it aside and forgetting it, but it was really, really scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that, you know, that I think when you do that kind of, you know, working in any kind of working culture where you see some things that are not present for the rest of the population, you carry around some ghosts with you. So I do feel like some of this work has some ghosts in it. And I think that's the first time I really kind of understood that. I knew that from talking to my mentor nurses from 20 years ago who worked in the HIV and the AIDS pandemic in San Francisco. That's where I was a nurse first for 5 years. I worked at a hospital that had like some of the very first, what they called back then gender reassignment surgeries, and in San Francisco. And those nurses talked about kind of working with some ghosts. And I held on to that a lot and was really soothed by some of those memories in my own practice in the last couple of years, and realizing like, oh yeah, that's okay. Those are my ghosts. Like that's okay. Cause I've been told that's what would happen. Yeah. Yeah. Here's a fresco from the side. I wanted people to be able to see how I build them on panels. It's a wood panel. I was trained by, Oscar Conejo and Marielle Capana, who teach at Skowhegan, and both also teach. One, I think, teaches at Swarthmore, and one at Cornell. They both teach fresco and painting. It's like a kind of plywood or wood backing with a steel lath, and then sequentially thin layers of sand with a kind of lime putty that gets mixed in. Your painting layer is called intonico, and underneath that is many layers of a scratch coat and a riccio until you build up to your painting layer. So it's a lot of like smearing these heavy lime layers into the previous layer. And you know,
do the lime layers have color in them? Are you putting?
No, they probably could. Mine don't. I use white lime, although the pigment, you know, is just straight pigment and water. That's what you paint with. The paint has no substrate. The lime reaches from below and grabs the pigment. That's how you marry the paint into the surface. It's a kind of chemical marriage like that. And so when the fresco isn't done right, then the pigment never marries and the paint comes off, or sometimes with aging that can happen too, or damage. But if you strike it right, then your pigment, you don't mar your surface while you're painting, and your pigment gets married to the lime and the
Right.
lime
Really
crafts.
fused with it.
Work on canvas.
How big is this one?
It's about 6 by 7 feet.
Oh, wow. It's a very large.
When I've been painting them, I've been painting them huge, bigger than me, and loving that, making like really big nurse paintings. And that's been really interesting to me. Like the sculptures, I haven't made, big nurse sculptures. I've been wanting to make these very small ones, but when I paint them, I want them to be huge.
Yeah. But this one's tiny, right?
No, this is actually 3 by 4 feet. It's kind of a bad
Okay.
image. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was thinking maybe it was the one centered in between the two large ones in the slide.
No, it's a
Like-
different fresco. It's a
Wow.
different fresco, yeah. Note to self to not use your phone to take photos of work.
Or put your cat in there so we can have scale.
Exactly. Yeah. Another a work with some nurses underneath a kind of a lake, I guess, really. I've been painting these lakes. One that you saw earlier in that image from Eve's space from Artist Curated Projects. And this is a new, also about 6 by 7 feet. And there's not much left of the nurses except those 2 brown streaks. So I don't really know what that means exactly. But yeah, I've been very interested in the space of the space of like the lake, going in my mind, returning to Skowhegan and the feeling of being on the edge of the lake and looking out on the water, and kind of what optically all these things that are occurring, all the reflection, and and all of the kind of depth of the green that's all around you. I grew up in upstate New York until I was like 10 or 9, and eventually we moved to Nebraska, and I grew up in places with lakes, and returning to Skowhegan again in 2021, I was really kind of craving the sense of my early ecology, and like my early geography, and being in that lake and swimming in the lake. And it was like
recentering yourself. It's
yeah.
And having that horizon line across the lake is very comforting.
Very much. Yeah. And also realizing that like the depth of the water that's in all the plants all around me, in those spaces, in those, like that kind of geography, is like the water is everywhere. There's just, it's, all around you in the trees, and it's making all the mosquitoes, and it's, a thing you're swimming in. And it's, so you kind of
the thing that you think is at rest, but is actually working.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you come home? I mean, how does your schedule work in terms of your art production? Do you come home at night and make work, or do you have kind of a different schedule, like a, firefighter's 48 on?
Yeah, much more. I mean, I'm not as brave as a firefighter, but I'm much more like I work 3 days at the med center, and if I'm lucky, usually 2.5, and then I spend the other days at my studio. And I don't work like 12-hour days at my studio. I can't really concentrate that long actually on painting. I kind of, I'll work for maybe like 6 or 8 hours and maybe go for a run or something like that. And I like to do it that way. I've had that studio since I got to LA, and I just love being out there. I'm right near the beach, I'm right near Otis. like 10 minutes to go to the beach if I want to, and right near the K line. And it's just been, it's a great place to have a studio for me. There's no real distraction around it. I just like can go there and go right to work. I did have a home studio in San Francisco for years. And I remember like, you know, kind of dying for my husband to go to work so I could start making art, you know, because I was like right in the apartment. I was just like, go to work. I need to make art. Like dying for it. So I have never not felt grateful for that, for sure. The studio is an amazing place of like wonder. And I am definitely a studio artist. Like I have done some post studio things, but I really do work. My mind gets to work once there aren't any distractions. I wonder sometimes if I'm just like, because I'm the second child, I'm so suggestible to other people that if there are other people around, I have trouble getting into my own mind, you know, getting into my space.
Yeah, but then at the same time, you've been doing these kind of more these projects for your community through the ceramics.
Yeah, that's true. I think I certainly could feel my experience with the med, you know, kind of bonding with my coworkers through the pandemic, kind of like never before. And after I made these big pots, I realized that the nurses and I and their families, we should glaze these together. And we'd been making a few little things with patients during COVID. And what was exciting for me was that I realized I could make ceramics with people in the room and bring it, put it into a plastic bag, then take it to my studio and fire it. And then I could send it to the families. And it was this amazing experience because the kiln, of course, the virus couldn't survive the kiln. So I could take these things literally out of the room and almost clean them in the kiln and then send them to the family members. And it was an amazing experience. These pots that you're looking at, I made with the nurses, but the nurses and I first made work with patients themselves. And it was a really very, very cool experience. And you know, making the work with the nurses also and their families was also a cool experience. And one of the things I didn't expect was that they wanted to write language all over the pots. Like I couldn't have predicted what they wanted to do. And I think right away someone was putting words on the pots, and it was very exciting for me to see. They had a lot to say, and I just wanted to make sure that they could say it. And so they just wrote kind of all over them, and they've been really magical. Now we just have this kind of ICU mini studio, and every once in a while when I get enough like small little pots produced, I bring in the pots and we just glaze ceramics together, and people are talking about, you know, patient care and then going right over and like, you know, working on their pot and then going back and working for 3 hours in the room and then coming back and adding one little green area to a pot and then going back into a room for 4 hours. And I see them really like be able to like kind of relax for a few minutes, the moments that they can get their hands on the glaze, and they're very like present to each other also during the day that the studio is there. And I've really loved it.
Well, it's nice you're in an environment that supports this.
Yeah, my director is a really like visionary woman who, I feel very lucky that I've met a director. I work in the medical ICU. Her name is Sherry Zhu, and she right away when I said, I think we should make art with the COVID patients because I can fire them in my studio. And that was a time when family members weren't allowed to have anything come out of the room. So nothing could be cleaned and had to be thrown away, all the belongings. But they could have this piece of art that came out of the room because it could be cleaned. And it was a kind of magical moment. And so now we do still do some of that work, but now we do a lot more just the nurses making small works for themselves, and, you know, giving something that I realized at the Med Center is that the nurses spend their whole lives in a place where their whole working lives in a place where nothing is without risk. Like there's so much risk all around them. And for them to have this moment where the mark is riskless, you know, like whatever they're doing is that's very powerful to have a riskless.
But also they're so separated from the natural world. You know,
Yeah.
every time you go into a hospital, it's like you feel closed in, and then to be able to work with clay and to work with your hands and connect with the earth.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sure that's really powerful.
Yeah, definitely.
So have you inspired any to drop nursing and just go to art school?
All the time I'm telling them, no, you guys need to go to graduate school. You need to go to art school. And I'm always telling artists that they should go to nursing school, because I also think that, the hospital needs more artists. I know a handful of nurse artists, and I work with 3 at UCLA actually, but also I think it's a really good combination. And I'm always telling people that they should go to nursing school. Nobody's taken me up on it yet, but I used to tell
You can write them a reference letter.
Yes, exactly. I used to tell people I was going to take out an ad in Extra magazine to just say like, hey, artists, go to nursing school. Like I'll tell you how to do something weird that won't, I don't know. I feel like they're they're in concert in my mind. They're in a good space together.
Mm-hmm.
So I know artists have to support themselves, and it can take a long time before maybe you find a kind of dealer that you are able to work with. And
right.
I like that old word dealer. I've been thinking a lot more about like listening to older like female artists talk about the freedom of finding a dealer that they really enjoy working with. And I think that's the language. I get that language. That makes a lot of sense to me. But I think until you find that person, you do have to put a roof over your head, and doing this kind of service.
And even finding that doesn't necessarily put a roof over your head.
That's right. That's right.
It's only one aspect.
That's right.
You have to keep it all going.
That's right.
A lot. These are really fabulous.
They were really, really magical to do. The families would tell me what they wanted me to say, sometimes on the back of one, or if they, were Zooming with someone who was end of life or in hospice, and they would say, oh, will you write this infinity symbol? Will you make this kind of mark? And then I would try to make that mark and then fire to them and ship it to them. And it was very exciting to open the kiln each time and have this message from beyond the grave, so it was really beautiful.
Your practice has a generosity to it that's really amazing and inspiring.
Thanks so much, Meg.
Yeah.
Really, I feel lucky that the Med Center has been so receptive to wanting to make art there, and they've really embraced it. So, and the nurses have been super into it. They're so open as a group. I don't want to make them sound simple. They're not. Very complicated ideas about, how they want to express themselves, like everyone does. So I just have only a limited, I have a limited palette of glazes, and I want to have everything food safe. But I can see all of their like marks that they're like bringing forward, all of their ideas. And I can see that their minds have been working just as the same as ours as artists. And they know what they want to do. So I love watching them make it.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you being here today.
Meg, thank you so much. Thanks everyone.
I believe our last image. So yeah.
Awesome. We
did it.
Thank you
everyone for being here. We did it. We are sticking to time. And I just want to let everybody know that we have Flora Cow coming up next in October 6th. So it's just a couple weeks away. And then this is our first, on October 14th, we're doing our first in-person studio tour with Kim Schoenstatt, Blue McWright, and Linda King. And the registration information's just been put up on the Brentwood Art Center site. So I'm hoping to will hopefully come visit Catherine at some point too, as we get to tour around LA and explore LA art studios.
I would love to have you back in my studio with anyone, Meg. And I'm very thankful for Brentwood Art Center. Really appreciate this format and their work.
Yeah, it's been really, this has been fun doing these conversations. And we've got a couple more coming up, so I hope people will sign up, and I hope you guys will sign up for the in-person studio visit or share with friends. And we just really appreciate the Brentwood Art Center and everything they do. So you guys have a great Friday, and we'll see you later.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Catherine. This was great.
Yep. See you later.
All right. Thank you.